Before World War II, tank development was moving at an unprecedented pace. New models appeared almost every year. Equipment and weapons were constantly upgraded. But despite all that progress, most machines designed in the 1930s proved completely ineffective when real war arrived. Soviet tanks were no exception, and some of them weren't just bad. They were dangerously, catastrophically bad. Today we find out which Soviet tank was the biggest failure of the war, from bad to worst. KV-2, the monster that couldn't move. At first glance, the KV-2 looks like the most terrifying machine on this list. A 152mm howitzer, armor up to 75mm thick, a weapon capable of reducing a fortified bunker to rubble with a single shell. On paper, an unstoppable force. In reality, one of the most unreliable combat vehicles the Red Army ever fielded. Built in January 1940 by the Leningrad Kirov Plant Design Bureau, its purpose was to destroy permanent fortifications along the Mannerheim Line. The concept made sense. The execution created problems that never went away. The engine was a V2 12-cylinder diesel producing 500 horsepower, later upgraded to 600. The ammunition was limited to 36 rounds of separate loading shells, which made the already agonizing rate of fire even slower. And then there was the turret. The electric drive motor could only rotate it on completely level ground, any slope at all, and it simply stopped. The commander had to choose between firing the gun and finding flat terrain first. At 52 tons, the weight placed catastrophic stress on the transmission. It broke down constantly. Visibility was assessed as unsatisfactory as early as 1940, before the war had even started. In the summer of 1941, when the front was collapsing and mobility meant survival, the KV-2 had none. It was devastating if it stayed in one place and never moved. The moment it had to retreat, advance, or maneuver, it died. Production ended in July 1941. Only 204 were built. Almost all were lost that same year, not to enemy fire, to their own mechanical failures. T-38, the tank that sank itself. An amphibious tank sounds like a genuine tactical advantage. Cross rivers independently, appear where the enemy least expects, scout ahead without waiting for engineers to build a bridge. The T-38 was supposed to do all of that. There was just one problem. It could barely stay above water. Production began in 1936. Armor was 6 to 9 millimeters of rolled steel. The armament was a single machine gun. The engine, a Gaz AA 4-cylinder petrol unit producing 40 horsepower. 40! For a vehicle expected to operate across all terrain, in all conditions, including rivers. The 1937 summer exercises exposed everything. The tank couldn't carry any meaningful load on water. 120 kilograms was enough to make maneuvering impossible. On a moderately sloped bank, it couldn't even enter or exit the water at all. And then calm water, with no load whatsoever, an attempted turn could send it straight to the bottom. It didn't sink because of enemy fire, it sank because someone tried to steer it. The cooling system failed repeatedly. In trials, roughly half the vehicles broke down from engine overheating and required complete motor replacement. The tracks came off on turns. Cross-country performance was inadequate, and the armor, thin enough to be pierced by heavy rifle fire, offered nothing against any real opposition. It stayed in service because nothing better was immediately available, not because it worked. Never because it worked. T-27, a signal flag pretending to be a tank. Here is a detail that tells you everything about the T-27. When the crew needed to communicate with other vehicles, they used signal flags in 1941 against the Wehrmacht. Production began in 1931. No turret, no radio, no observation devices. Armor of 10 millimeters assembled from plates bolted and riveted onto an angle iron frame, oriented mostly vertically without any slope. Protection against rifle bullets in favorable conditions. nothing more. The crew of two sat in the rear of the hull alongside the engine with no partitions separating them from the machinery. At high speed, the rigid suspension created violent vibration that made accurate observation nearly impossible. By the mid-1930s, dedicated anti-tank guns were standard equipment across all major armies. Against those weapons at 300 meters, the T-27 had no answer. By 1941, standard German rifle-caliber armor-piercing rounds could penetrate it, not anti-tank guns, rifle rounds. It was defenseless before the serious fighting even began. Some were captured by the Wehrmacht and repurposed for auxiliary duties. That fact alone summarizes the military assessment. The enemy captured them and didn't even bother using them in combat. They became tractors, German tractors. T-26, 10,000 death traps. Here is a number that should stop you cold. On 22 June 1941, the first day of Operation Barbarossa, approximately 10,000 T-26s were in Red Army service. 10,000 tanks, more than the entire armored force of most nations on Earth, and almost none of them survived the opening weeks of the war. Production began in 1931, based on the British Vickers tank purchased the previous year. By the standards of the early 1930s, it was competitive. From 1933, it received a single turret and a proper cannon. And then the world moved on, and the T-26 didn't. The armor was 15 millimeters of homogeneous steel, officially rated as anti-bullet protection. In practice, it offered meaningful cover only against standard infantry rifle fire, and only in optimistic conditions. A 95 horsepower engine drove it at speeds already inadequate for 1941. The suspension was chronically overloaded. By 1938, foreign tanks had surpassed it in every category except armament, and the gap was growing every month. By 1941, the T-26 was facing an enemy equipped with dedicated anti-tank artillery across the entire front. The result was predictable and catastrophic. Thin armor was one of the primary reasons Soviet armor losses in the opening period of Barbarossa reached numbers that are still difficult to comprehend. Production continued until 1941, when the war itself made clear, in the most brutal terms possible, that the machine was completely unsuitable for modern combat. 10,000 tanks, gone in weeks. T-35. The parade tank that collapsed on contact with reality. For years, the T-35 rolled through Red Square on May Day parades, while crowds cheered and foreign military attachés took notes. 5 turrets, one 76.2mm main gun, 2 45mm cannons, 6 machine guns firing in every direction simultaneously, a crew of up to 11 men. It looked like the future of armored warfare. It was, in fact, one of the most spectacular failures in the history of tank design. Serial production began in 1933 at the Kharkov locomotive plant. The T-35 was designed to break through heavily fortified enemy lines, a land battleship that could create a wall of fire in every direction at once. The armor was 20 millimeters on the hull, 25 to 30 on the turrets. The engine was an M17 petrol unit producing 580 horsepower to move 50 tons of steel. Theoretically, unstoppable. In practice, a disaster waiting for a war to expose it. The problems were not minor. They were structural and unfixable. 5 turrets sounds powerful until you realize one commander cannot effectively coordinate fire in 5 directions simultaneously. The armor that looked formidable on a parade ground was anti-bullet protection on a machine the size of a building. Against artillery, it offered nothing. The running gear and transmission broke down constantly under the weight they were never properly engineered to carry, and the sheer size of the vehicle made concealment impossible. It was the largest, slowest, most visible target on any battlefield it entered. When war arrived in 1941, the T-35s of the 34th Tank Division, Kiev Military District, were committed to combat. They were gone almost immediately. The majority lost to mechanical breakdown before ever firing a shot at the enemy.
Vehicles that had thundered across Red Square on television collapsed on their own drivetrain when real operational tempo demanded they actually move across real terrain. Only one original T-35 survived today, at the Kubinka Tank Museum. 2 replicas have been built. The rest destroyed themselves on the roads of Ukraine in the summer of 1941, abandoned by their crews, waiting for repairs that never came. The parade was over. The war had no patience for parade tanks.
5 tanks. 5 different ways a machine can fail. Broken transmissions, armor that couldn't stop rifle fire, designs unmanageable in combat, and concepts that looked revolutionary on paper and disintegrated on contact with reality. Before the war, these vehicles represented progress. When the shooting started, the truth arrived fast and without mercy. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Leave a comment. Which Soviet tank do you think deserved a spot on this list?